Hello everyone. Today we will be finishing up chapter 3 and talking about the structure of the brain and how do we actually study the brain. And so to begin with, what we see there are three major divisions of the brain. And these divisions include the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And these divisions are discussed in order by location, starting from the base of the brain at the back of the head and going towards the front. And so the first structure or major division is the hindbrain. And the hindbrain coordinates information coming into and out of the spinal cord. And this basically controls the basic functions of life. And so that may be breathing, heart rate. We'll get more into that when we talk about the functions of each of these structures. And so the hindbrain consists of the medulla, the reticular formation, the cerebellum, and the pons. The second division is the midbrain, and the midbrain is responsible for orienting us and for our movement. And so it consists of the tectum and the tegmentum. And then the last division of our brain is the forebrain. And the forebrain is responsible for more complex functions, including regulating our emotion, planning for our future, and consists of the cerebral cortex and the subcortical structures. So here is the hindbrain, and we'll turn to the structures that actually make up the hindbrain in each of these three major divisions. And so the cerebellum right here is known as the little brain. And the cerebellum controls fine motor skills such as playing an instrument, playing sports, and other fine-tuned behaviors. The medulla, this whole structure here, the medulla is an extension of the spinal cord and coordinates our heart rate, circulation, and respiration. Inside the medulla here we have the reticular formation. And the reticular formation regulates our sleep, our wakefulness, and our arousal. And then lastly, the pons right here, when translated into Latin, it means bridge. And so really what the pons do is the bridge acts as a bridge and relays information from the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. Here we have the midbrain and the structures that lie within the midbrain. And so the midbrain is a very small division of the brain and consists of the tectum, which orients us to our environment by sensing stimuli and moving us toward that stimuli. And so one example of that is if we heard a big loud crash out in the hallway, we would orient ourselves that way by looking in the direction of that noise, and that's the tectum in action. The midbrain also consists of the tegmentum that is involved in movement and arousal, awareness, and attention, and it's also in orienting us towards sensory stimuli, so if we heard something or felt something. On a side note, something that's interesting about the midbrain and the hindbrain, we could actually technically survive with just a midbrain and a hindbrain. We'd just be missing out on a lot of the advanced functions from the forebrain, which includes these structures here. And so one of the big systems within the forebrain is the limbic system. And so here is the limbic system. The limbic system is made up of the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, which are responsible for motivation, emotion, learning, and memory, as well as interacting with other structures. And so here again, we see that with the forebrain, we have more advanced functions for more higher order type of thinking. And so in addition to the limbic system, there are two main sections of the forebrain, which include the cerebral cortex, which we see right here, and the subcortical structures. So the cerebral cortex is this whole area right here, and it's the outer layer that's most visible to the naked eye, and it's what we think of when we picture a brain. That wrinkly gray matter, that's the cerebral cortex. The subcortical structures are structures that lie underneath the cerebral cortex near the center of the brain. These structures include the corpus callosum, the thalamus, and the pituitary gland. So again, these structures are responsible for higher order functioning, including motivation, emotion, learning, and memory. So getting more into the structures that actually make up the subcortical structures, and even more so, the next slide will go more into the limbic system. First, we'll start with the subcortical structures. So here we're provided more information about these functions of these specific structures. And so if you imagine sticking your index finger in each of your ears and pushing inward until they touch, that's where we would find the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia. All of these structures that are within the forebrain. And so the thalamus not only relays information to the cerebral cortex, but blocks information processing during sleep, resulting in a more restful sleep. The hypothalamus, when translated into Greek, means under. This lies under the thalamus and regulates functions such as our body temperature. And lastly, the pituitary gland lies underneath the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus sends hormonal signals to the pituitary gland, which sends them to other glands to control stress, digestive activities, and reproductive activities. And one example of this would be during breastfeeding. And so sensory neurons send signals to the hypothalamus, which signals the pituitary gland to release the hormone oxytocin, which stimulates milk release. And so here we see this chain reaction of all of these subcortical structures in play. Here we have the limbic system, and this also includes the hypothalamus. So we'll move on to the amygdala. And so the amygdala, when translated into Latin, means almond. And this is located at the tip of the hippocampus, and it is involved in emotional processes, especially the formation for emotional memories. So, for example, it is responsible for remembering vivid details of, say, if you remember the Moore tornadoes, even if you lived closer to there and knew someone that was involved in that situation, those memories would be even more vivid for you. These memories last and seem to be especially involved in fearful events. And so that's when the amygdala kicks in and we have those vivid memories. And then lastly, the hippocampus. This is vital to the creation of new memories, and if damaged, people may experience memory loss and can only remember things for a few seconds. So what we do see is that they can still remember how to drive and talk, but they just experience difficulty in developing new memories. Here we have the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is a group of those subcortical structures, and it directs our intentional movements. It includes the striatum, which is responsible for posture and movement. And we see that individuals that suffer from Parkinson's disease have these symptoms of uncontrollable shaking, and it's due to an undersupply of dopamine in the basal ganglia. And so here again we see the subcortical structures and its association with those neurotransmitters and how they interact to result in a different type of behavior. So an undersupply of dopamine within the basal ganglia then leads to symptoms of Parkinson's and uncontrollable shaking. So here we have the cerebral cortex, and moving from the inside out, the cerebral cortex is that outermost layer of the brain. And we can think of the crinkling, again, of the brain as a way to cram a lot more surface area into a small space. So the cerebral cortex is the highest processing layer of the brain, and it is divided into two hemispheres, each with 4 lobes. And the two hemispheres are connected by and communicate via the corpus callosum. And so that's almost that split down the middle that we think of when we think of the brain, or a picture of the brain. Here we have the 4 lobes of the brain making up the cerebral cortex. Starting from the base of the brain and moving forward, we have the occipital lobe, which is this blue part right here, the parietal lobe, the yellow section, the temporal lobe, this red section, and the frontal lobe, this purple section. So each lobe has a specific function, and starting back here and moving forward, the occipital lobe is responsible for visual information. So one example shared in an earlier lecture was if you fell back while playing sports or even walking on ice, if you fell back and hit your head, odds are that you came up and you were either dizzy or you might have lost consciousness, given how hard the fall was. So this is due to the occipital lobe and related structures being located at the back of the brain. And so that's one way to think of the occipital lobe. And so it'll be important to understand which each of the 4 lobes are and where are they located within the brain. So the parietal lobe is associated with touch. The temporal lobe, which is located above your ears, is responsible for hearing and language. And lastly, the frontal lobe, which is up here, processes higher order demands such as our movement, abstract thinking, so thinking outside of the box, planning, memory, and judgment. And one individual that we will talk about in the next slide, and I'll introduce it here, is Phineas Gage. And so he's a prime example of an individual who had damage to the frontal lobe and as a result experienced deficits in judgment, planning for the future, and emotion regulation. And so all of these high order functions are located within this frontal lobe. So here, when we talk about before we had advanced technology, and most research was done after somebody, for whatever reason, had damage to their brain. As a result, we'd study them to see what was different from typically developing individuals. And this led us to understand specific areas of the brain necessary for different functions, such as emotion regulation and language production and comprehension. So Phineas Gage, who's pictured here, around the late 1840s, had an iron rod shot through his head. And so here's a recreation of that incident. And so this happened while he was working near explosives on the railway, and he went from a mild-mannered, quiet individual to an irritable and profane individual. So later they discovered that Gage had damaged his frontal lobe. And his case helped scientists further understand brain function and their interconnection between the brain and its results on our behavior. And so again, this is how we started to investigate the brain. This is one way of investigating. This is also another case of case method, or a single study on one individual. And so this Phineas Gage's story was unique in that he had this rod shot up through his head, and so by studying intensely on just one single individual, we were able to learn more information or gain more knowledge on the brain and the specific functions that were related to that specific area of the brain. And so here we have other ways of looking at the brain and how, what is its activity, where are specific functions located within our brain. And so here we have some non-invasive ways of looking at brain imaging. And so there are several ways of researching brain activity, including these non-invasive measures of imaging. And the first one we have is our EEGs. And so EEGs measure electrical activity in the brain and records different patterns of activity among different behaviors such as sleeping, learning, and actively trying to remember a piece of information. CAT scans were one of the first neuroimaging techniques developed and take several X-ray photos of the brain from different angles and combines them together to produce an image of the brain that can be examined from different angles. MRIs provide a more specialized and clearer picture of the brain scan in order to examine the structure of the brain. So it's a more specialized X-ray or imaging of the brain than what we first had in the CAT scan. And the last two that we have, fMRIs and the PET scan, these, on the other hand, are neuroimages that display brain activity when we're doing a different task or we're doing a task, and they also display brain activity under different conditions. And so different areas of the brain light up when we are listening to this lecture as opposed to when we are reading and studying for the exam. And so with that wraps up chapter 3 and talking about the brain structure. Again, we talked about the 4 lobes within the brain, the 3 major divisions of the brain, and how do we actually study the brain.